the workshop, oh, sorry, things are popping up on my end here. I'm still not very Zoom proficient. I wish I were. Okay. The people who attended the CSD workshop in the spring, which was enormously useful. And I also want to thank Rain Tagapera, who met with me individually and helped me sort through some things and gave me comments on a previous draft of this paper. So just before I started, just acknowledging that. All right. So I have a PowerPoint that hopefully you can all see, right? Okay, so the title of this paper is Competition in Congressional Primaries. The working title of the book manuscript is Money as Muscle in American Elections, and it should become pretty clear as to why that's the title as I continue. Okay, so the motivation of this project is pretty straightforward, and I think that's one of the things that I like most about this project. So we start with this expectation, this truth, kind of, that competition among candidates or parties is a necessary condition for democracy. But the question that I'm asking here is, who counts as a candidate and what counts as competition? And I've been thinking about this question for a really long time. It started, it actually was born out of my book on who runs for Congress. And when I was writing that book, I had to decide how to measure a congressional candidacy. And the central argument of that book was that moderates are less likely to run for and remain in office than those at the extremes, which further exacerbates the ideological distance between the two parties. And for that book, I went with the standard definition, which was those who appear on the ballot. So somebody who's been voted on by the electorate. But in the process of that, I really realized that there's actually no discussion about who does count as a candidate. And for me, that was really important because I was looking at state legislators who were running and not all of them were on the ballot. And what I presented last spring was about dropout decisions in elections. So one part of this is separate from what I'm going to talk about today, but it's all kind of related about how we measure a candidate and how we measure competition. So the general approach has been to use vote totals and victory margins to study who's a candidate and how good is competition. That's where this project is starting. So there are two main sort of literatures that this particular paper is speaking to. The first is a really old literature actually on what Mayhew called the vanishing marginals. So since the mid-20th century, there's been a decline in close general elections. And close general elections are typically measured as those where the winner won with less than 55 or 60% of the vote. More recently, and in large part because of this decline in close general elections, scholars have shifted to the study of party primaries. So there's been I wouldn't say a literature quite yet around primaries, but it's a growing and surging area of interest. And part of that is rooted in general elections becoming less competitive. Okay, so these things kind of go together. So what I would call if there is a sort of the book on primaries was published just last year by Shigeo Hirano and Jim Snyder. And it's called Primary Elections in the United States. And that is sort of the standard book right now. And they developed they used 4 different measures of primary competition. So like whether or not a race was contested, whether or not the winner won by a close margin, the total share of the vote that went to the loser, and the number of candidates in the primary. Okay, so they use a bunch of different measures to look at changes in primary competition over time. And their sort of main finding in this book that really covers like from 1900, I think, to 2016. So it covers a really large period in American history of party primaries. But their main conclusion is that electoral competition is highest in open seat primaries in state districts. So that's their kind of general conclusion about the state of where primary competition is better. But this is really an important conclusion because what they're suggesting is that primaries sort of substitute general election competition in this way. So primaries contribute to the electoral system by selecting quality candidates and by allowing candidates to compete in uncompetitive districts. So even though incumbents may be winning by larger margins, even though general election competition is declining, they still have to face pretty fierce competition in order to be selected initially. Okay, so both of these things are kind of connected, and I want us to keep that in mind. But they really hang their hat on the state of competition in open seat primaries in safe districts. Okay, so as more members are elected from these districts, not to worry because they must face competition to be elected initially. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to depart from that argument a little bit and push back on it and challenge it, because I think it's kind of a little wrong. Okay, so the argument that I'm trying to make is that when competition is viewed through a different measure, through a fundraising-based measure rather than the ballot, it actually looks a lot worse. And it looks a lot worse in precisely the primaries where Hirano and Snyder are saying that competition is really good. So these open seat primaries in safe or advantaged party districts. So that's the sort of empirical contribution. The theoretical contribution is to introduce a fundraising-based measure of candidates in competition that I think more closely captures viability and strength than post hoc vote shares. Okay. So the real sort of difference between my approach and their approach is I'm not relying on the ballot at all to measure candidates. I'm not relying on the ballot at all to measure competition. I'm not relying on the ballot at all for this assessment of democracy. And then I'm going to show you a little bit of over time differences on how these measures differ. Okay, so the main finding, again, is that on-ballot competition, or that competition looks worse when it's viewed through a fundraising-based lens. On top of that, on-ballot measures get it more wrong in recent years because of the plethora and the surge in long shot or candidates who have no chance of winning. Okay? So that's sort of the general argument that I'm trying to make in the paper, and hopefully I will convince you of today. Okay, so the main theoretical contribution of this paper and this project is to depart from on-ballot measures of candidates and competition. I am building on, so a lot of this was, like I said, had a very helpful meeting with Rain Tagapera, and this is similar in spirit to their work, but different in the sense so what they do is create measures of the effective number of parties, and they weight seat shares to say which parties in a comparative system are more influential, more powerful, and less influential and less powerful. And so my project is very similar in spirit to theirs, and that I'm weighting candidates based on their fundraising the fundraising disparity across candidates, but it's different in the sense that I don't start with seats or votes at all. Okay, so what I use is pre-election receipts to measure the number of viable candidates. And this is a primary level based measure of the number of candidates that is really standard in the weighting literature. So it's just the sum of all of the primary receipts in that district, in that race squared over the square of each individual candidate's receipts. So this is the standard formula that's very similar to that used by Tagapera and Sugar, Laxo and Tagapera. And the goal here is to similarly weight candidates based on their fundraising success, okay? Rather than saying all candidates count equally. Okay, so just like the effective number of parties literature is the goal is to not weight parties equally. The goal here is to similarly not weight candidates equally. The reason I think that this is a better measure of viability than post hoc vote totals are actually, I think, illustrated in the 2020 elections, which I'm happy to talk about later. I think people overestimated how competitive or how close some of these elections were going to be based on their fundraising totals. I don't have 2020 in the data that I'm going to present here, but because my data go back to 1980, none of it really matters for the findings anyway. But the reason that I think fundraising is a better measure of perceived viability than post hoc vote totals is because they are before the election. So they are at the time when people are talking about how competitive a race is perceived to be. I think that if we step back and think about the purpose of candidates for democratic society, the purpose is to inject competition into the system. And perceived viability more closely matches how credible candidates were at precisely the time when, we need to hold elected officials and other candidates accountable. The other reason I think that fundraising is a really good measure of viability is it's the single most valuable resource for candidates today. Top fundraisers almost always win. The winner raises the overwhelming share of receipts. And many, many candidates raise absolutely nothing. And for candidates who raise absolutely nothing, they should not be considered competitive by today's standards. So I was surprised when I first started this that 20% of candidates on the ballot don't raise any money. They don't file any reports to the FEC. So they're raising less than $5,000, that means. 25% of non-incumbents don't file reports with the FEC. So these candidates aren't really injecting competition into elections in the same way a candidate who raises half of the money in a race is. The other reason I think that money is a really good measure of viability and perhaps a better measure of viability than other commonly used measures is because it's a better predictor of winning than these other measures. So the most widely used measure of quality or likelihood of winning in the study of congressional elections is Gary Jacobson's measure, whether a candidate has held previous elected office. And 52% of experienced candidates win. But compared to 85% of top fundraisers, this is much, much lower. So I think the real holy grail is to be experienced and raise a lot of money. But if I were choosing between the two, I'd choose money over quality every time. Of course, there are limitations and normative concerns that are worrisome. So first, the empirical limitations are most notably that the data only go back to 1980 when the FEC has these publicly available records. So whereas Hirano and Snyder and anybody who uses election outcomes data, they can go back to as far as they want. I can only go back to 1980. So my analyses is limited to are limited to the modern era. The normative concerns are notable, and that what I'm really saying is that money, the downside is that some candidates are the money is a really large predictor of who holds power today. And that is very disconcerting and problematic for both who runs as well as who wins. But I think that it better maps onto American politics today. Another sort of strange outcome of this project is that it's a very different understanding of representation that differs from the standard way of thinking about representatives as representing their district. So now if I'm measuring strength based on how much money a candidate has, a lot of this is coming from some of this, an increasing amount is coming from outside of their district. But there is new research by Brandis Keynes-Rones and Ken Miller showing that the proportion of out-of-district receipts that a legislator receives is associated with how responsive they are to the national donor base. So I think there's some truth to this as well, despite the normative concerns to come along with it. Put differently, I don't think these normative concerns are a problem for the measure, but I think they're a problem for democracy. Okay, so what am I trying to do here? I really should spend a long time on this slide because it was an enormous data undertaking, this project, but I won't because it's a little bit boring to hear this versus democracy. But what I have here is a data set of more than 30,000. Now I have about 33,000 candidates who ran for the US House of Representatives from 1980 to 2020. I'm only presenting the results from 2018 here today. In my data set, I have all reports that were filed by the candidate during their candidacy. So I have quarterly reports, I have pre-election reports, I have total amount of money they raised in the cycle. The data set also includes ideology measures that were created by Adam Bonica. I also have whether or not the individual held previous elected office, the standard measure of political experience. I generously, I received these data, I collected these data, but I also received experience data from Rachel Porter and Sarah Truhl from 1980 to 1988, from Stephen Pettigrew from 2000 to 2010, Hans Hassel from 2004 to 2014, and Gary Jacobson generously shared all of his general elections quality data. But that's sort of what the data set looks like in terms of the measures that are applicable to the talk today. Within that data set, well, from that data set, I collapse the data by the primary race level. So I have about 15,800 observations in the data that I'm going to be presenting today. And it's broken, the data are broken down into 7 different primary types. And the way that I break down the data is modeled exactly after Hirano and Snyder, because what I'm trying to do is to compare in this paper how a fundraising-based measure of competition is better, or in this case, worse than a vote share based measure of competition. And so the model of the results are modeled exactly in the way that Hirano and Snyder break down their results. And so the primary types are there are 7 of them in different seat types. So what does this mean? So there are 3 different types of races. One is open seat primary, so there's no incumbent in the district. The other one is the second one is incumbent contested primaries. So these are primaries where an incumbent was in the race. And the third is challenger contested primaries. And these are primaries where the incumbent is in the other party. Then we look at differences in district partisanship. And there are 3 ways to break down district partisanship. So these are party disadvantaged, and this is where the other party received more than 57.5% of the vote. Parties balanced, where both parties in the district received between 42.5% and 57.5%, and party advantage. And this is where the candidate's party received more than 57% of the vote. Okay, so this is the kind of main way of breaking this down, which I'll talk about more when I get into the results. But just so you know that it's at the race level rather than the individual level. So the dependent variables that I'm most interested in are the number of on-ballot candidates, to connect this with Hirano and Snyder's findings on the number of candidates in the race. My calculation of the number of viable candidates based on fundraising disparities, the equation that I showed you before, and then the difference between the measures. So what I'm going to show you in the results today are the number of on-ballot candidates and the number of viable candidates, but I'm happy to show you a bunch of other ways that I've measured this as well. The main independent variables that I'm looking at are seat type. So again, challenger party, open seat, or incumbent contested, and district partisanship, advantaged party, parties balanced, and disadvantaged party. And what our concern is how the seat type is associated with the number of on-ballot candidates and the number of viable candidates based on my measure. Okay, so this is just plain over time descriptive data, okay? And in the left panel, you see the number of on-ballot candidates. And this is very similar to what Hirano and Snyder show in their book. Okay? And there are two main things to notice here. First is that the number of candidates on the ballot in open seat is highest in open seat primaries. The other thing to notice is that the number of on-ballot candidates in open seats has increased in recent years. I am not showing this because I need to I need to be absolutely sure, but I've added 2020 and the number of on-ballot candidates goes above 7 in open seats in 2020. Okay, so basically there has been an increase in the number of on-ballot candidates in open seats in recent years. The right panel shows the averages with the fundraising-based measure of the number of viable candidates that I'm putting forward in my paper. And here we can see one similar thing is that the number of open seat of viable candidates in open seat primaries is still a lot higher than the number of viable candidates in incumbent contested or challenger contested primaries. But the difference is smaller, and we don't see an increase in more recent years like Hirano and Snyder show. So I'm going to unpack this a little bit more, but I just wanted to show the descriptive trends in competition and the differences between my measure and Hirano and Snyder's measure, and sort of just conventional on-ballot measures of candidates, unweighted measures of candidates. So the main finding of the paper is here. This is this graph, which is that competition diminishes with a viable candidate measure, especially in advantage party open seat primaries. Okay, so this is the left panel shows the number of on-ballot candidates. And just like I told you at the outset, Hirano and Snyder are really hanging their hat on the black dot that's close to the 5. Okay, so the advantage party primaries in open seat primaries in advantaged party districts. And they say first that primary competition is really good in these districts, and we should be less worried about Democratic competition as a result. And again, this is important because the proportion and the number of elected representatives who are coming from advantaged party or safe party districts has increased. Okay, so this should put us at ease a little bit. The right panel is the number of viable candidates calculated with my measure. And we can see in these sort of where we're hanging our hats on for democracy, the number of candidates is a lot lower. So the average decreases from 4.9 in the Hirano and Snyder, the on-ballot measure, to 2.6 on-ballot viable candidates in my measure. And I mean, the other thing to note, which I do in the paper, but I give less attention to that than the advantaged party primaries and open seats, is that the number of candidates is really lower in every kind of race. Okay, so if you use a fundraising-based measure, the number of viable candidates is lower across races than if you use an on-ballot candidate measure. Okay, the next comparison that I won't spend much time on is to compare the viable candidate measure with something that might be a little bit closer to apples, which is an experienced candidate measure. So how does our picture of the number of candidates with a fundraising-based measure differ from the number of experienced candidates on the ballot? And here the difference is not as stark, but we still see a small but significant disparity between experienced and viable candidates. And again, precisely the seats that we're increasingly pointing for is important for injecting competition in democracy, in our democratic system, okay? So here, I think the totals are like 2.1 versus 1.9. But again, we're seeing lower levels of competition in advantage party open seat primaries with a fundraising-based measure of candidates. If we break this down by decade, I think this is actually really interesting. So this is the difference between the number of on-ballot candidates and the number of viable candidates. And again, this is the party primary race level. So we just subtract the number of viable candidates from the number of on-ballot candidates and see how this average changes over time. And the thing to take away here is that on-ballot measures have always overstated the degree of competition. Unweighted ballots measures have always overstated the degree of competition, but they're particularly likely to overstate the degree of competition now. They're more likely to do so now than they were in the 1980s and 90s. And this is important because this is precisely the time when more elected officials are coming from these advantaged party districts as well. Okay, so in a nutshell, Hirano and Snyder are overstating the degree of competition. They're overstating the degree of competition even more today than they used to. Okay, so the reason why the degree of competition is being overstated is because much of this increase is driven by long shot candidates or candidates who are not going to win. So the top graph shows the number of candidates who raised less than 10% of the share of primary funds. Candidates who raise less than 10% of pre-primary funds never win. Okay, so I mean, not never, but the average of the amount of money that candidates raise usually is something like 80 in the 80%. If you take out unopposed races, you're still at 60%-ish. If you look at even in an advantage party open seat primaries, the average amount that the winner is raising is like, I don't know, in the 50s. Okay, so candidates who raise less than 10% of all pre-primary funds have little to no shot of winning. And if you see on the top left graph, we see advantage party open seat primaries and parties balanced open seat primaries. So much of this is driven by an increase in long shot candidates, particularly in Republican primaries. So there used to be like one long shot candidate in Republican primaries in the 1980s. Now there's 3, that's tripled. If you look at right below that, the number of experienced candidates, so inexperienced candidates, excuse me. So these are candidates without previous political experience. The average in the 1980s was about 2 in these open seat advantaged party primaries where they're really hanging their hat on. Now there's almost 4. Democrats are following a slightly different trend, which is has decreased from the 1980s to 2000s. These are the long shot or inexperienced candidates or candidates who aren't likely to win. But I do think the shift from the 2000s to the 2010s, which is not statistically significant, but is the upward trend is interesting because it suggests that the rise of money in politics is not dissuading candidates from running. But what's happening is that we don't see an increase in the number of viable candidates. We're seeing an increase in the number of on-ballot candidates, and levels of competition have remained largely the same over this time. Okay, so it's not the case that general elections have become less competitive and therefore competition has increased in the primary stage. Yes, general election competition has decreased, but it's not been substituted by increased primary competition. And I think that's really important to remember because it's what a lot of people are saying, and in fact, what scholars are saying too. And if you use an on-ballot measure, it would suggest that. But if you use a weighted measure, I don't think that what I think more accurately captures competition, then you don't see this increase in primary competition that people are suggesting. Okay, so I think I was supposed to talk for a half an hour. I have just a couple of minutes left to review what I talked about today, and then next steps. So the main point of the talk is that, in the paper, is that when competition is viewed through a fundraising-based lens, it looks markedly worse than on-ballot measures suggest. In the best case scenarios of competition, so the advantaged party open seat primaries, the number of viable candidates ranges from 1.8 to 2.6, much lower than the average of 4.9 on-ballot candidates. And the disparity between measures, or where the on-ballot measures get it wrong the most, has increased in recent years. And the reason for this is the surge in long shot candidates, and particularly on the Republican side. So kind of stepping back and talking about the project more generally, this has been a really fun project, because I've gotten to think about these really basic concepts in American politics in a really different way. It's been very rejuvenating and fun. But I think what's most fun about it is that money, there's so much potential, despite the normative concerns and why this is really bad for democracy in so many ways. And like empirically, money opens up so many opportunities to study elections in a way that is not sort of constrained by the ballot. So what I talked about today was how money can be used to study the quality of competition and changes in competition over time. But we can also use money as a predictor of election outcomes, or maybe not as a determinant in general elections, but in the primary election, in the primary stage, voters are not, we don't have this like huge partisan queue that supersedes everything else. And so Adam Bonica has two papers showing that the causal impact of money at the impact of money in the primary stage may indeed be causal, whereas in the general election stage, maybe not. Or there would be less reason to think that it would be causal in the general election stage. But the reasons for that are different than in the primaries. And so I do think money can be taken advantage of as a predictor of election outcomes in a different way. The other really neat thing about money is, because I have quarterly reports, I can use these to look at changes in competition within the cycle. So rather than after the fact, I can look at how competition is unfolding in a more dynamic way. Another really real benefit is that, like I said at the beginning, I've been looking at dropout decisions for a while. So because I don't start with the ballot, I can find all these new people to count as candidates that an on-ballot measure would miss. So I can look at why some people drop out of the race and others do not, and how this ultimately matters for the people who for the choices that are presented to voters. And then from the institutional side, money can be aggregated not just at the race level, but it can be aggregated by legislators. And we can use the fundraising ability of legislators to see how that matters for the distribution of party rewards for those who are elected. I'm also going to be working on a new paper on the trade-offs. There's a lot of talk about how the time trade-offs that legislators have. And so I can see whether or not those who are better at fundraising are worse at legislating, or whether those who are better at fundraising are just better across the board, including legislating. But there's just a lot of ways that money can be leveraged to look at these questions. So I will end there, and thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your feedback.
Okay. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I absolutely love Money is Muscle as a title, so I endorse. We can generate questions in two ways. One is that you can use the chat function. and I would be happy to intermediate and read them. Or you can raise your hand and direct your question directly to Professor Thomsen. And Danielle, if you prefer to field your own questions, that would make things even smoother. But either way, I will elevate some text questions and give everyone a second if they have a question they'd like to ask.
Thanks, Graham. That sounds great. I think Lewis has his hand raised here.
Thanks, Danielle. I was wondering sort of how funding aggregators that have appeared, I think more recently over your time periods or towards the end of your time period, play into the story. Emily's List is obviously the sort of oldest example that I think a lot of us remember, but I know there are others. I certainly, because I've given to one person, get a lot of emails from other people trying to funnel money to them. How do you factor in sort of that networking dynamic of fundraising and then of course viability?
Yeah, that's a good point. So the short answer is I don't. The more, I guess, the better answer kind of is illustrated by 2020. So I think that okay, how do I say this? I still think money is the best, is like the best, is the variable that is most highly associated with winning. But in 2020, I think like 24 of the 27 toss-ups that have been called, the top fundraiser won in only like 21% of those. Okay, so in 2020 in particular, in this very small subset of toss-up seats, money may not have been advantageous, and part of this might be because of like Act Blue and the real surge in out of, so I think Act Blue is a really good example of funding aggregator that is sort of moving money towards certain candidates. That might be a challenge, except that I think that the reason people thought that there was so much surprise in 2020 is kind of rooted in the amount of money that these candidates had. And you can, like, I actually think Harrison and McGrath are probably not even the best examples because partisanship was so heavily not in their favor. But in some of these congressional races, which were expected to be close and toss-ups, and they were not, that is I think one of the reasons for the surprise is because of money, is not unrelated. Emily's List is also an interesting case. So it used to be that Emily's List, I think, gave money earlier. Now they wait until candidates demonstrate an ability to raise on their own. And I think that is quite consistent with this argument that they want to bet on the winner as well. And usually they do. So, but I think part of where the advantage of where I'm sitting with this paper versus a paper on predicting election outcomes is that I'm really only saying like all they have to do is be related. Money and winning has to be related at a pretty high level, and that's where the validity of the measure is, and that continues to hold, except in these handful of 20. But in the other 415, money is very highly correlated with winning. Matt?
Yeah, I got one. So when I think about viability, I think of it as, well, I'm not sure how I think of it, but one way to think of it is as like a threshold condition that like you either get there or you don't. And I'm not totally sure on the measure, but like one way to think of it would be like, given the district, like how much the media market is or what you expect your opponent to raise or something, there's some like threshold. You have to raise this amount by this date, which is different than raising some proportion of the aggregate total spending. Like, is it possible in your data for somebody to get to viability and then fall off, like be viable at some point, but then not be viable at the end? Or is it like you can't know 6 months out from the election if there's any viable candidates? You need to get to the end, in which case it sort of confuses the whole notion of viability. So I'll just leave it with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I have not done that, but I could basically say, because I have all of the receipts much earlier, I could say, what about 2 quarters? Is there anybody who, so one threshold that I've used is 20%. So if you raise at least 20% of receipts in the district, then that is associated. But you could imagine any of these thresholds. Of course, the higher your threshold, the more the fewer people, the fewer winners who have reached that, right? So if you have a really low threshold of 10%, like almost all the winners raise 10%. If you go up to like 50%, then your how well it maps onto winning goes down. Right, so that's one of the challenges of like what's the threshold. One of the benefits of a race-based measure is it accounts for those differences in the media market, because it's calculated within the district or within the primary, right? So if one candidate raises, so let's say you have 2 candidates and they each raise half of the funds. So this is just like the effective number of parties stuff. There would be 2 candidates in the race. There would be 2 parties in office. If you have one candidate who raises 90% of the funds and another candidate who raises 10, your effective number of candidates or your number of viable candidates is a little bit over 1. But the nice thing about that is that those 2 candidates are working within the same constraints of the district. So it's not pegged to members or candidates in a totally different seat. It's pegged within race to so not only meaning like the seat type and district partisanship, but also the cost of the media market and all these other things that matter. So it is a relative measure of viable. It's based on the amount that the other candidates it's based on the disparity among candidates who are running. So what I can do to address that, or to think about that, which I haven't done, is to look at like 2 quarters before the primary. So I have all the primary dates of everybody from like 1980 to 2020, and I can just do 2 quarters and see whether and how many of those who raise, let's say 20% at T-2, raise less than 20% at the time of the primary, which I haven't done, but that would be really helpful to know how much of this is changing versus how much of it is solidifying, right? So if it's just solidifying, then I think this is then it would be a better measure of perceived viability all along.
Yeah, I think the proportion stuff is really cool, and it does in some ways sort of self-correct for the cost. But it's also going to be screwed up in some ways. Like the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is going to attract a whole bunch more money, irrespective of the demand side of the equation, that like for how much money they need to run. So you could have people not be, whereas even if they're in what I'm trying to get at is there any possibility of thinking of it from the flip side of like thinking of before the race even started, before there were any candidates or anything, if we were just consultants and we came in and said, how much would you have to raise by what date to actually mount a viable campaign, to hire the staff that would be necessary, to even imagine running a media market campaign, whatever it would take? What's that number? And then that is a different question than relative to what other people raise, right? It's just a question for you. Can you hit your target, given that we're in Iowa versus that we're in Newport Beach? And I think yours does indirectly get at that because of the natural toggling of, but I'm not totally positive that like 10% in each district is going to map onto the conceptual notion of viability totally equivalently. I'm not sure I said that well, but hopefully well enough.
Well, empirically, there are very few races where the candidate who raises 10% wins. But one thing I was thinking, I wanted to follow up on this about okay, so would you peg it to the previous amount of money that candidate raised in the election before? That's also a challenge though, because let's say they were elected. So if you have like in these best, so there's a lot of ways to look at this project, right? And some of like what you're talking about is like is a different part of, not about competition, but rather about really kind of election outcomes as the dependent variable. That would be, I think, more rather than measuring competition. But if you, so let's say a non-incumbent wins in an open seat primary in a safe district, okay? And they raise $5 million. Okay, then in the next period, we wouldn't expect them to raise as much because competition would be expected to be lower. So I don't know if then you could use the previous election as your benchmark.
I was thinking of it more like, say, what's the cost, and this will be my last one, but what's the cost of hiring, like, say, 10 staff given the cost of living where you are, running an advertisement campaign that hits however many media points, and sending out X number of mailings that, like, you know, sort of a foundational, what is the fundamental cost of running a campaign here, not a relative to previous examples or my competitors. If this is what it would take to even for anybody to even reach name recognition, say, what's that?
Okay. I can look into that. Thanks. Stephen?
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed this, particularly just like how rich and descriptive it is. And I kind of had a question along those lines of just, I know in one of the footnotes you mentioned very few candidates kind of self-fund, but I was just curious about kind of patterns of that, particularly over time. And I'm almost wondering, to kind of Matt's point about, you know, just the difference of like, in how many places can you kind of be viable just by pumping in a little bit of your own money, versus the, you know, the sheer amount. If you end up with someone who's able to do that, what that kind of distorts, because you imagine a primary where you've got a few candidates and then all of a sudden I just dump in a ton of my own money, right? Suddenly I can effectively make the other candidates not viable, both in kind of reality and in your measure. And so I was just curious about how kind of common self-funding is throughout that might produce some of the patterns he was mentioning.
Yeah, so self-funders, so first, they're overstated. There are hardly any of these self-funders. There's like, I don't know. So Open Secrets, I need to put in a dummy in my model, but there are like 15 candidates who put in over $1 million into their campaigns. This does matter though, because I'm using total receipts, and that is included in total receipts. It does matter for, like, for example, whether a candidate who raised 20% of the amount would be more valuable in that race. So like, there's one of my favorite examples is this guy named Rudy Moyes in Florida. And he is this like movie producer, doctor, lawyer, like it's just this wealthy guy. And he put in a bunch of money into his campaign, and that's the district that Frederica Wilson won and represents. And so her percentage of the total in the district is, I think it was like 20% or something. But it's much lower than normal, and the reason it's lower is because of Rudy Moyes. And the reality is most self-funders, they don't win. Like very few self-funders don't win very often. And so what I'm gonna have to do is just put in a dummy. But Open Secrets has a list of everybody who adds more than $1 million in. I just think they're outliers rather than anything more systematic. One thing I will say too that's interesting about this, so I use district fixed effects and year fixed effects, and I don't say anything is causal, but the design of the model and the paper is very similar to a lot of people who are doing diff and diff analyses, including state and or district and year fixed effects, and calling them causal. I don't think it needs to be causal because I'm just trying to step back and measure competition, but the design and the model resembles diff and diffs that are called causal. I would not, yeah. So, but I do include, these district fixed effects to try to account for some of the things like the media market that would really shape the ability for more candidates to be viable. But self-funders, I'll need to add in. I haven't, just because the model follows like exactly what Hirano and Snyder did, but I'll have to do that in the future. Thanks. Graham?
Yeah, so I'll go back to something Lewis had raised. In many ways, Matt and Stephen are asking how much for viability. I'm interested in the from where side of this. In other words, in the pre-primary contributions, where is this money coming from? And how is the messenger of money shaping viability? I live adjacent to a person who spent much of the last 4 years raising money. And when he first started running his campaign, he viewed it as buying contributions. He had to show he could hit a certain threshold in order to achieve the subsequent goods that would come with being viewed as viable by the party itself. And so do these pre-primary contributions include party PAC contributions? Do they include significant party activists or donors that we know are kingmakers in party politics? Are they instead measures of viability that you have the hustle and game to raise the money in order to be seen as credible? I mean, in many ways, what you're doing is leaning heavily into this measure of viability. And this measure of viability is in and of itself used to determine by the party and others who's viable. I mean, it's not a tautology. It's completely consistent with your argument, but I'm terribly interested in where this money is coming from and what patterns we're seeing, and whether there are party level patterns in where this money is coming from and when. Being in an open primary seat, a top 2 primary seat, I've been fascinated with the inability of parties to clear the deck. And so you're suggesting a different story, and I'm kind of interested in hearing about it.
Yeah, so the short answer here is I have no idea where this money comes from. Like 90% of my life is just sitting here looking at numbers going, what a waste, what a waste, what a waste. And now my RAs, and they're like, God, can you believe this person spent 200 grand and dropped out? I'm like, I know. So this is a monumental puzzle to me. But I don't know where all this money comes from, but it comes from somewhere. One thing I wanted to say about this party donors thing, I think this is really overstated. So I was on a panel with somebody who is really, really into the party. The party is the one influencing elections and influencing the nominee this year. And I said, what share of a candidate's money comes from these party affiliated donors? Okay, so they're measured as people who donate both to the party committee, so like the Democratic National Committee, and the candidate. And the response was about 2%. And I said, perhaps against my better judgment, but this is a smaller space here, I said, do you really think that's consistent with the party deciding? Like 2%? Like, I mean, I just don't think that's what people have in mind when they think of the party deciding, but I could be wrong, So, or like the amount needs to be a lot, like or it needs to be super early, but 2% I don't think is overwhelming evidence that the party is deciding when you're getting, I mean, that's just not much. So I think that most of this money is coming, like the pre-primary early money that I'm talking about. And I think that, that's something I should think about more with respect to what Lewis was saying about bundling and how much of this is coming later on. So it could be that more of this is coming, my guess would be that more of this is coming in the general election period. But in the pre-primary money, I think it's just networks based. And Adam Bonica has new stuff on why lawyers have such an advantage at the ballot box that are more likely to win. It's not because people have this overwhelming preference for lawyers. In fact, most people hate lawyers. But what's going on is that they're giving a lot of this early money, which is sending, and they're raising it from other lawyers, and it's sending this message that they're the most viable, and then indeed they win. So I think a lot of it is coming from professional networks, but the reason I think that is because of Adam Bonica's work. I don't think it's coming from these national party donors, at least in the primary stage. But in the general election stage, in these 25 cooked toss-up districts, sure. But that's not the norm. Like, the norm is that congressional elections are incredibly uncompetitive, and even in the best case scenarios, they're not as competitive as people say.
Have you looked at like candidate training documents and recruiting documents in state legislative party politics? Like the kinds of things they tell candidates when they train and recruit them. So I've heard people go to these things and they're being told to run for much lower levels of office to gain candidate experience. They're also being told that money is king. Like, there's a whole series of things that are consistent with your story about, candidate selection that are happening before it, that would just be, I'm sure you probably have some fun stories about it, but fun things that are completely consistent with the story you're telling here.
Well, I mean, everybody talks about how much money matters, and look at Georgia, I mean, at the beginning, it's like, what do you do to help somebody win? You send money. And I don't think that it's a causal effect. I think most of the time people bet on the winner. But what I'm trying to say is that it's a really good indication of who is expected to win and how many candidates are expected to be competitive. And I think it's a better measure than, if you look at Harris at the Graham race, people thought it was going to be way closer. People thought all of the races this year were going to be way closer. And some of this is part like you don't know. But the other benefit of this measure is I can actually measure an upset. An upset would be somebody who raised less won. How can you measure an upset so there's a lot of, despite the fact that, so I'm not really getting into the causal stuff here, but there's a lot of power in money, both in terms of just raw associations and perceptions. And a lot of the reasons that people don't run, so Nick Carnes's book, a lot of the reasons that people don't run is because they think that they don't want to raise money and the costs of running are so high. So I think we can look at it as what are the recommendations, what Graham's talking about, what are the recommendations for those who do want to run? What are the kinds of skills that you have to have in order to launch a viable candidacy? But you can also look at this from the other side, which I think is more of the normative concerns that I was talking about, which is why are the people who would be good candidates or who are dropping out, why are they doing that? And if you ask them, they say it's because of money. And if you read newspaper articles and I interviewed a handful of these dropouts in the spring, and they talk about they couldn't raise any money,
As long as we're sitting here in awkward silence, I'll talk. So one thing I was interested in is is there evidence that a primary campaign with 4 candidates, what is more competitive, or what does that actually mean on the ground? I could imagine if I were the incumbent, I would rather have 3 roughly equally divided opponents as opposed to 1 alternative. And so I'm just thinking about what does it mean to have the correlation between competitiveness and number of rivals.
Yeah, so this is a really good point too. So in the conclusion, I talk about how the number of viable candidates is associated with victory margins. So as the number of viable, which I don't even remember the actual data here, but the number of viable candidates. So this, Gary Jacobson also made this point, by the way. That's a good point. He read my paper too. Okay, so in opposed advantage party open seat primaries, the average margin of victories in primaries with less than the mean of 2.8 viable candidates is 28% compared to 15 points in primaries with more. So they're winning by closer margins. And this is really important with respect to like the vanishing marginals literature and like how close elections are. So, I mean, the correlation between primary vote share and share, so vote share and share of receipts is super high. It's like 0.9 to 1. Much of this is because of unopposed races, which I include here because I think they're really important and a lot of people throw them out, but they tell us something. If we exclude unopposed races, the correlation is still like 0.82, okay? But the reason why the vanishing marginal stuff is so concerning is because it's like, if there are no close elections, so on my one AFSA panel, they were like, well, how many candidates do we really need, you know? And one guy was like, well, I guess more than one, you know? And I mean, which I don't even know if that's true, right? But if we're going to say that that the lack or decline of close elections in the general is a bad thing, which is what like 3 decades of people said, then a primary with 1 candidate and 3 long shots versus 1 candidate and another viable candidate, which presumably your vote share is going to reflect that, those are different primaries. And one is better for democracy, better for injecting competition that we all talk about than the other. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about that, if you look at incumbent contested, so in opposed incumbent contested primaries, the average margin of victory in primaries with less than the mean of 1.3 viable candidates is 64 points compared to 35 points in primaries with more. The percentage of incumbents who win dropped from 99.6% in primaries with fewer than 1.3 candidates to 91.8% in primaries with more. In primaries with at least 2 viable candidates, incumbent victory rates decreased further to 86.5%. So, I mean, I guess I don't really think that incumbents need to be reelected, that high reelection rates are inherently bad. But a lack of competition, I think we need to take a look at this in terms of like how it relates to democracy, which is reliant on, particularly in these advantage party open seat primaries. So if there are no other questions, I'm happy to show you some other things or to talk about 2020 or we can end either way. Whatever you
what I'd recommend is okay.
Yes, on 2020.
Yeah, people are clamoring for 2020.
2020?
That would be my choice. I don't know, maybe that would be my.
I'm muted because I have a shrieking baby on my lap, but that would be my choice too.
Okay, so 2020, there were a ton of candidates. So the average went up even higher to 7 in these advantage party open seat primaries. The number of candidates in the on-ballot, or in the advantage party open seat primaries in this whole series, so 1980 to 2020, went up from 4.8 or 4.9 to 5, which I know sounds very small, but when you're talking about 16,000 observations, that's a lot. So there were the other thing that's interesting about 2020, I think for my project in particular, I was thinking about this because I've been reading, so Dave Wasserman tweeted that money may have been a harm, a hindrance to candidates rather than helping. And I just joined Twitter and I retweeted that one. I don't know if it's a hindrance exactly, but it's not associated with winning to the same degree. So we don't know what would have happened had the person not raised any money. But again, I want to emphasize that this is a really small number of races. So a lot of this is how you measure it. And this is why I like this project so much, or enjoy doing it, is because there's a lot of ways to think about kind of everything. And so like Cook, for example, they focused on like 27 races. Okay, well, Hirano and Snyder, their measure of competitive is anything within from 42.5% of Democratic, any district that's within 42.5% of Democratic vote share and 57.5% of Democratic vote share. So this is a much wider range of what counts as competitive. So the why this matters is because the association between being, let's just say, the top fundraiser, being the top fundraiser and winning, if you use a broader measure of competitive, is much higher. So like about 80% of those and that wasn't actually all that different in 2020. So those lines are pretty constant over time. But if you look at, in fact, I could probably, let me see if I can pull it up. I haven't really finished it. Maybe I shouldn't. I'll just wait. I'll do that another time. It'll take too long. But as a comparison, so my expectation in 2020 was that, coupled with the broader prediction that Democrats were going to pick up anywhere from 5 to 15 seats, I looked at these 27 races, and the Democrat outraised the Republican in 21 of them. Okay, so in the vast majority, about 3/4 of these races, the Democrat outraised the Republican. So I thought that they would take a greater percentage of the toss-up seats than they did. And in fact, I think the Democrat is only winning in 2 of them right now, but basically Republicans swept the toss-up seats. They overperformed in Republican leaning districts, and they overperformed in Democratic leaning seats as well. Even when the Democrat won, they won by a smaller margin. In 2018, the Democrat who raised the most, the candidate who raised the most in these toss-up seats won 60% of the races. And so I thought that was going to hold true in 2020, and it did not. So like I said, they only won in about 20% of the association was much lower in 2020 than it was in 2018. When I put this in a longer time period, so I've added in the Cook toss-up seats from 2000. I'm trying to get the rest of their data for the whole period, but even 2018 was a pretty high mark in terms of the association between being the top fundraiser and winning. Usually it's about 50%. I mean, they're toss-ups, right? So, but the association was especially low in 2020, which I think is notable. But for me, I'm just trying to measure what was perceived as competitive. And I think that I think that this difference between what happened in the election and what was perceived is actually when my measure can be more valuable. So when they are so highly correlated, I think a different measure, is good in terms of temporal, what it's mapping onto temporally. But when those differ, So like these upset cases, or like 2020, I think was surprising in a lot of ways. Then I think a fundraising-based measure can help us make sense of what happened in terms of why expectations were off, than a vote-based measure. I don't think those can help us make sense of that at all. Oh, Matt has it. One of the famous folk knowledge ideas is that lawmakers always feel they are in a competitive district, even when they are not. It'd be cool if you could show how quickly a viable opponent can emerge, even against a member who is previously dominated. Yeah, so this is interesting, like running scared, so everybody said, oh, all members of Congress, Fenno, I think, said that all members of Congress ran scared. I think they do, but I don't think they're all equally scared, so some of the districts, like in this year, I've actually thought, so I wonder how many of the Republicans who retired this year wish they wouldn't have, because they thought that the year was going to be so much worse for them. Like Will Hurd, I bet Will Hurd is like, damn, why did I retire? Like I would have cleaned up, but if you look at the partisan breakdown of who retires, it is also illustrative of who thinks that it's going to be not as good of a year. And there is a surprise sometimes. Like I think 2020 is a surprise between expectations and reality. And I think my measure helps us get close to that. But I can try to think about how quickly, like, it's tough when the argument is kind of perceptions based. Like somebody suggested that I do a survey experiment of all of the campaigns this cycle and ask them how, I was like, no thanks, but how competitive they thought, everybody else was. And I was like, or I could just use 16,000 observations of actual election data. But I know it was a particularly contentious app this year, but anyway, yeah, a lot of it is perceptions based. I did apply for a grant to do a survey of former House candidates to ask them who they thought was the most viable and to list the names. And I think that could be illustrative again of this broader concept that already has so much space validity that I do kind of feel a little bad doing all of these. I would like to do it. I would like to get the funding and to do it, but I think it's just going to reinforce the same result, but from a different angle. So like if they can't remember, so in one of my interviews with the dropouts, he said, well, there was like me and one other guy. He said, well, there were two others, but like not really. And that's what I'm trying to pick up. It's like there's me, one other guy, two others, but not really. That's the project. It's an entertaining kind of endeavor. So anyway.
I feel like a jerk talking so much, but I also hate sitting here in awkward silence. So it's like, I just wanted to say, because I've asked so many questions, like I think this is really cool. Like I think that there's so much interesting. This obviously is right in the sense that like just looking at, because some random guy always runs for governor in some or for Congress in some random, and the threshold to get on the ballot is low, that capturing the distinction between like there were four of us, but really there were two of us is really valuable. And I'm totally convinced that you're on to how that works. And if anything, I'm like super intrigued by, like, even if you just like, we're able to develop profiles of types of races, and then even just qualitatively went to like Emily's List donor experts and had them say to you like, hey, here are 10 races. Could you score these 1 to 10 on which ones you think you could make a difference on? Like, so it would be sort of, it's not quite survey experimenty, but like just at the qualitative level, sitting on the shoulders of experts who actually judge viability in thinking about real money would be super fascinating. And I think you could do that in ways that nobody has ever been able to parse out so it's super promising.
Thanks, Matt. That's really helpful. Like a lot of, because it is perception, like a lot of this is perceptions. I do need to, like, I need to round it out with more qualitative data. It's kind of hard to know where to start. So this is the good one. Like, it's just everywhere, right? So Kamala Harris was picked because she was believed to be a fundraising asset. This candidate this race is believed to be competitive because this competitor raised X and X money, or is like really, surging. And I mean, it's sort of everywhere so much, but the conventional wisdom in political science is still that money is not a determinant. I haven't really pegged it to that yet because I don't need to for this project, but I will have to weigh in. I will have to do that at some point. But not for this paper, I don't think. But I can easily talk to, the people who are deciding for Emily's list, which races where they decide to endorse. I think that would be a really good, I think I'll have to do this for the book. I was going to say one more. Yeah.
Can I make a recommendation? Which is like, at this point, were we in, 5206 on the long abandoned 5th floor of SSPB, we'd be like lingering. I'd personally be lingering, hoping people would leave so I could grab an extra sandwich without people seeing me. And others of you would have genuine things you wanted to talk to Danielle about. But I'm going to hang out. I don't know who's in charge of it. Danielle, did you say you had the Zoom? And we can keep the conversation going. And but we'll end the formal talk at this point. Does that sound like a reasonable? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody again for coming and for your helpful comments. It's been really useful presenting this multiple times at UCI, and I just want to thank you for your feedback and for taking the time.
Have you gone down to San Diego yet?
Yeah, I presented